right. I think I am ready to roll. I think I always do this. These are always my intro videos. I always start by saying something like, all right, hey, well, let me show you something. Here I am. I'm in the office. It's Monday, which means we're doing another 30-30 challenge video. And so I hope you have been going through. I hope you have taken the challenge, that you've gone for 30 days with us. By the way, that's going to be running out next week on the 30th. But good news, you can redo the 30-30 challenge with us, because that's going to be part of the culture of Royal Palms going forward, is 30 days at a time, little bit by little bit, just learning, teaching the Bible in our homes. By the way, as you're probably looking back here, you've noticed I've added something. Yes, probably you have not noticed, because who are we kidding? I have noticed because I placed it here, but this was given to me by Pastor Josh. He and I have an affinity for Star Wars culture, and this is a knitted Baby Yoda. I think he's got extras, so if anybody wants them, be his friend, take him out to lunch, and maybe you too will have a Baby Yoda. I'm going to put him back up there, right next to the copies of the BHS that I have. Anyways, so today on the 30-30 challenge, let's get started, and let's start talking about what it is we need to answer. So the question of the day obviously comes from the Cornerstones book we are going through with our families. And if you have not started, it's an incredible book to go through. I would welcome you to join us and do this. But here's the question for today. Here we are. We're talking about God, right? We are going to be asking, what can we know about God? So here's the question. What can we know about God? So really, we live in a culture right now where people would say, well, you can't know anything about God. And if you've been tracking with us and been going through the book, you'll see that the questions are kind of getting us to this point. We can know certain things. If you'll look at that, we've talked about general revelation, special revelation, but there's some specifics that we can begin to talk about as we talk about how can we know God. So I love this answer, and I know it's kind of hard, but I think I want to try to help you break this down so you can think about it, and you could even begin to try to talk to your children about it. Now remember, we want you to try to memorize these things with your kids, and even if they don't get it right now, that's totally fine. I mean, you think about this. We watch movies with our kids. We read books with our kids. They don't grasp everything that's being said all the time. They sure know how to quote it. They sure know how to try to at least say it. But later on, it may make sense. And that's what we're trying to do here. So here's the question. Here's the answer. What can we know about God? We can know what God is like, what he wants, and how we can have a relationship with him. We can know what God is like, what he wants, and how we can have a relationship with him. So if you have bought the parent guide, and if you don't have this yet, I can't remember. This is pretty cheap on Amazon to get. I really love the companion here. It's put out by Broadman Holman Publishing, so part of Lifeway. But I really like this because it gave some ways to kind of break this down. So here's some things I want you to think about, because even as an adult, I start to think about, this is pretty deep stuff. So let me walk you. It kind of gets me excited to talk through some of this stuff. The first thing we would talk about are the attributes of God. So the attributes of God. Now, this is something that's interesting, because we talk about, for us, right? We talk about as people, we say, well, they have certain attributes or character qualities is what we mean. But as humans, right, we might be, someone might say about me, right? They could say, well, he's a very talkative person. Now that's the case for a lot of the time, but I'm not always talkative, 100%. Or you might say he's a super handsome person. And that would be one that you could say pretty much all the time I'm handsome. But there's a tiny bit of time when my looks are not what they are. And that's hard to believe, because even on camera, But here's what I want you to see is that with people, when we talk about character and attributes, people can be those things, but they're not always those things. So you think about someone who's nice and caring. I remember somebody I used to work with in an office, and their demeanor was a very calm, very quiet demeanor, but they also were a business person. And I remember hearing them on the phone when an order had gotten messed up, and the company was going to really try to mess her up. And I remember hearing her on the phone go from sweet, kind of kind and quiet to, you guys messed this up and you're going to fix it. And I thought, yeah, that's right. You pull that out there. And so you recognize we are not things all the time. But when we talk about God, we talk about the attributes of God. God is these all the time. So some things that the book talks about, if you want to go a little bit further to the idea of what God is like, we have to talk about the attributes of God. So God is not just things partially. He's not just loving sometimes. He is always loving. He's not just truth sometimes. He's always truth. Really, the truth is with God, he doesn't demonstrate them only sometimes. He is these things. All of these traits of love and truth, all of those things are things that come and pour out from him. He is the source of love. And so when the scriptures say that God is love, it's showing that love pours out of him. God is the standard of love. He's the source of all love. When it says that he's truth, he is the standard. He's the source of all truth. And so when we talk about that, we need to recognize that God never changes. He is them all the time. And we talk about the attributes of God too. God is not just, he's not more loving than he is more truthful. He's not more, as we go on to talk about the justice of God, he's not more loving than he is just. He's 100%, he is perfect in all of his attributes. And so when we talk about knowing who God is, we can talk about the attributes of God, but as Christians, we need to recognize that no attribute exceeds the other. He doesn't have more of one or the other because he is the source of which all of those attributes in all of their perfection. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about, if we're going to talk about that sentence, no, we can know what God is like. Let's talk about the next part. It says, and what he wants. Ultimately, this comes up with discussion of the will of God. And so we talk about the will of God. As Christians, we should talk in two ways. First off, we have the will of God, which is, what does God want you to do? I tell my kids all the time, what does God want you to do right now? Well, really, the commands that he gives children are to honor their father and mother, right? So for right now, really, what they need to be doing is they need to hear the commands. As mom and dad are taking in the commands and seeking to follow the Lord, that we are to now begin to implement that in our home, but our children are to follow what we say. And so we are trying to build them up in the Lord. But right now, the will of God for them is to follow and obey their parents. Now, of course, we expand that, but we can say even for us, what does God want us to do? That's the first piece. How does he want you to live? How does he want you to act? There should be that piece of you just saying, what does God want me to do? Now, there's the other piece, which is the will of God is what God has decreed or what God has chosen to do. And so that's a piece where you're able to look back in the past and recognize that God decided to let things unfold in this way. Sometimes we look at that and we say, you may not completely understand right now in the moment what God is doing, but we can go backwards and say, okay, God chose it to play out this way. The way that you are, where you live at this point in your life was because God chose to let it play out that way. God can do whatever he wants, but we can go back and look at the will of God by the way that he unfolds things in our own lives. And what we should be doing is looking and praying for God's will to be done ultimately in our own lives, and to say that what we want is what he wants ultimately to come down. Not what I want, not my own will, Granted, he has a plan for me to do, but I also want to say at the end of the day, I pray for his kingdom come, with his will be done. And we should be looking at in all things, even as we look at this election year, right? At the end of the day, I should be resting on, I know what I want, but what I want is his kingdom come first and foremost, and be okay with that. Okay, the last piece of this, right, as he talks about this, is we can know what God is like, what he wants, and how we can have a relationship with him. And so part of this comes back down to is knowing God, knowing God. And so we need to realize is that how we know him is, well, it's kind of a cycle here. I love how this book closes in this part here. He says, the more that we know God's perfect attributes, the more we will love God and trust him. The more we love and trust him, the more we will want to follow his will for our lives. And the more we follow his will for our lives and experience his goodness and kindness, the more we will want to spend time with him in prayer and worship. And the more we spend in time in prayer and worship, the more we will understand his attributes. And so the beautiful cycle goes over and over. So God wants us to know him. And the first way he wants us to know us is through the person of Jesus Christ. When you hear the gospel and you understand it, you have made that first way of knowing him was through the way he revealed himself in Jesus. You trust in the gospel, and that's your beginning point, right? But then we begin to foster that relationship by praying and talking with him and worship, and then starting this process of trying to know all about him based on his attributes and based on his will. And that's how you begin to follow him and to know him and have that relationship. Is you begin to know as I go through life, this is what I know about him. I've prayed, I put this before him, I trust him with these decisions. And so it is a cycle of saying that. So one of the verses that I'll leave you with comes from Acts 17. And I want you to think about this. This is Paul, and here's what he says in Acts 17. As I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I even found an altar to which it was inscribed to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, I proclaim to you. So here's one thing that's interesting is Paul is saying, right, that you people worship God in ignorance. You don't really know who you're worshiping or what you're talking about. In that case, too, most of these people, they've come up with some sort of a God. Notice what he says, right? He says that the God who made the world and everything in it, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in shrines made by hands, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. See, he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. Let me stop here. So one of the things he's pointing out, right, is he's saying that we have the ability, humans, and we see this throughout the scriptures, humans have gone to worship the creation rather than the creator. We have built in our own minds what we think a God should look like, and Paul is calling them out on that. He says, you guys are ignorant about who he is, and here's who he really is. He talks about that he doesn't need us for anything, but yet he gives us life and breath. Notice what else he says. From one man he has made every nationality to live over the whole earth and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries where they live. So he's talking about how he started the world and how he spread things out. And really, everything has a season. Nations rise and fall, all that stuff. Then he goes, this is the key verse for today. He did this so they might seek God, and perhaps they might reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. We'll come back to that. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are also his offspring. Since then, we are God's offspring. We shouldn't think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image fashioned by human art and imagination. See, the Bible tells us exactly who God is, how we can know him. We need to recognize it's not about what I think he should be like. It's about who he is and revealed in Scripture. And that verse, I love verse 27. Notice what he says. He did this that they might seek God and perhaps might reach out and find him, though he is not far from each of us. God wants us to reach out and to know him. This God who we talk about, who created everything. Right? This week, you'll look through the book and you'll talk about his eternality too. He is here. He will always be here. We will fade away as every generation has passed, and yet he wants us to know him and have a relationship with him. It's a really cool thing to ponder. So I hope that helps this week as you walk through this stuff. Whether you're doing this with your family, try to break it down and to talk more about it. You can spread this out over a few days even to think about each one, or whether this is just you at home. But I hope it's helpful to understand that, as we go back to ask that question, right? What does it say? What can we know about God? Here's what it says. We can know what God is like, what he wants, and how to have a relationship, how we can have a relationship with him. All right. Until tomorrow, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.